Hello, this is Adam Carroll from Justice for All, and this show is UN This Week. We're going to be talking about shrinking civic space and protecting human rights at the UN. As we mark the 75th anniversary of the UN, Turkish diplomat Volkan Bozkır assumes charge as General Assembly President today, emphasizing not only the larger UNGA, but that the Security Council reform is also crucial, not only for the member states, but also for the United Nations as a whole. With the veto power exerted by 5 permanent members of the Council, it is unclear how meaningful reform is possible at this time. Despite the shrinking of access and influence that we will be discussing today, the NGO community is also taking advantage of the gathering of world leaders, even if it is taking place largely online. Side events encourage discussions on the impact of COVID-19 around the world, and other events focus on other sustainable development goals. The UN's Climate Week coincides with the gathering as well. Our recent guest on this show, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, has sent a letter signed by 56 former prime ministers and foreign ministers from 20 NATO member states, as well as Japan's former prime minister and former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, stating that the risk of a nuclear weapon being used appears to be increasing. Those countries in NATO that it's addressed to have not joined the 2017 UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. They rely on the nuclear umbrella of the United States. The pact will take effect 90 days after the number of ratifications reaches 50. The figure now stands at 44. But today, the center of focus was once more the speeches of national leaders. So we're going to play whoever is giving a speech at this moment in the UNGA, and please look at the screen and see who we get.
Mexico.
Yes.
We have a history and a cultural tradition, just as other countries of the world do. At this point, I could talk to you about the major civilizations that played a part in the foundation of what our country is today. I could speak to you of the great cultures that flourished in what today is Mexico.
All right, we'll cut him off there. However, it could be an interesting speech. Each speech has a very different character. You've got, in fact, Brazil has been the first country to speak in the UN General Assembly for 63 years, despite not being first alphabetically anymore. The tradition began a long time ago. Call it tradition or call it a habit. But Bolsonaro started off the show, and soon after it was U.S. Ambassador Kelly Craft speaking this morning in her introductory remarks, praising President Trump's leadership record at length, first celebrating the agreement between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain regimes, and singling out the role of Afghan women in peacemaking. In his broadcast remarks following hers, President Trump bragged numerous times about the size and power of the U.S. military and claimed our policy is peace through strength. He blamed China for the so-called China virus and claimed that the World Health Organization is totally controlled by China. He mostly blamed China, saying, "Those who attack America's exceptional environmental record while ignoring China's rampant pollution are not interested in the environment. They only want to punish America, and I will not stand for it." In response, the head of Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass, tweeted that what is on the surface an anti-China speech at the UN, listening to his China counterpart speak Trump's speech did China and its president a favor by allowing China to present itself as the more responsible country, one that believes in international cooperation. However, Mr. Trump also stated that the US will always be a leader in human rights. My administration is advancing religious liberty, combating the oppression of women and the criminalization of homosexuality, and protecting unborn children. Trump referred to women's oppression, human trafficking, and the ethnic cleansing of religious minorities, but without mentioning either the Uyghur or the people of Tibet, or the Rohingya for that matter. So human rights rhetoric and human rights reality, very different. We have with us today a savvy veteran of the struggle of maintaining honest and effective human rights work at the UN, Bobbie Nasser. Dr. Nasser, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Great. Just a real brief bio. Dr. Nasser represents the International Federation of Settlements and Neighborhood Centers at the UN and has since 1991. She has served on the executive committee of the NGO Committee on Human Rights since 1997. And Dr. Nasser is a mental health clinician and has worked for 36 years with refugee communities and as a social work professor at the Wurlitzer School of Social Work. Don't Wurlitzers make organs? Wurzweiler. Sorry. That's quite a background. Yeah. So
that's who I am. Yeah.
Yeah. So just Bobbie, if you could say just briefly, what is the IFS? The International
Sure.
Federation. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Okay, so this is really an organization I'm very happy to be connected to because it's literally a community-based organization. So the settlement house tradition is the tradition of working within a neighborhood, and the neighbors, the people that live in the community, lead the agenda. So they identify their needs, and then the professionals that are involved come in and develop program direct response to the needs of the community. Some communities might be more focused on, let's say, education. Some might be more focused on mental health. Some might be more focused on advocacy in terms of expanding certain kinds of programs like housing or whatever. But that's the nature of it. And there are quite a few of them right here, actually, in New York City, as well as throughout the US and in 25 additional countries. So I'm very happy to represent them because you did.
Well, I was going to say, I once had some summer youth employment students one summer. We had 8 of them from Henry Street settlement. And also,
exactly.
Yeah, and I know they also provide Meals on Wheels kinds of services, all kinds of things.
All kinds of things, yeah, from literally the smallest child human being. Yeah, so a full range of services, yeah. And yeah, so anyway, very happy to represent them at the UN. And I think just by virtue of being community-based and grassroots-based, then human rights is part of their work because they're always trying to make sure that the people that are having these needs that are very important and very vital to, let's just call it the basics, that they're being every way shown respect and provided dignity through the services. And it's not a top down, it's a bottom up. And then frequently the people that have been served end up being the same people that run the agencies or work within the agencies. So that's always very good, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
So human rights
I represent at the UN.
Yeah. Sorry to overlap with you. So human rights, not just legal rights, but social rights, economic rights, the whole schmear, right? I mean, it's all interrelated.
Right, the whole schmear, exactly. And they are all interrelated, right? Yes.
How did you come to be a leader of the NGO committee, which I think you've been doing for quite some time as well?
Yes. So I'm going to take this back to the World Conference Against Racism in terms of, I think, taking more of a leadership role within the committee. So at that point, the committee was not, I guess it had fallen. See, the committees, all the NGO committees at the UN depend on volunteers. There's nobody's paid, right? So I saw that no one was stepping up. And I thought, well, this isn't good. And so I stepped up. That's what happened. And the thing is that I've always been interested in bringing people together. That's what I like to do. So I'm always looking for common cause and people that have the same kind of interests. And I also don't like a narrow focus. I like more a focus where we're saying, okay, if somebody now thinks it's more important to focus on the climate crisis, which of course it is, then I'm going to say anyone that wants to come in with that as their angle, please do. And the beauty of the UN, so I'm going to say something positive about the UN, working within the UN framework. The beauty of the UN is it's actually far more open and flexible to NGOs than most people realize. And I was very impressed early on, and now I'm going to go back to the late 80s, early 90s when I first started doing, let's just call it advocacy within the UN system. So before that, I'd been involved in civil rights and this type of thing within the US. All right, so then I knew how hard it was to approach, let's say, the Congress or something like that, or local representatives. I mean, you could do it, but it wasn't, you had to always make sure that you had appointments and you had the right connections and this kind of thing. And then they said, well, no, you can go direct to the missions. You can talk directly to the missions. You can go right up to the Office of the Center for Human Rights. You can talk directly to them. And it was true. It was true. And so what I've seen over the years is that a lot of NGOs will come up together and they'll say, okay, well, what's our common cause? And let's figure out how to lobby. So a recent example that I've been very aware of is there's an NGO committee on older persons, and they're lobbying in a very effective way to make sure that there's more attention to the human rights of older persons. And they've done this in a very systematic way in the sense that they go around to different missions. They make sure that they have good connections within the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And then each year you can see they're making advances. So it's a kind of persistence that I think pays off. And it's always very important, though, I think, to stay connected to other NGOs as well as people within the UN system. Yeah.
I have heard some of them.
You were talking.
Just to say, I agree with you. I've heard some of them speak, and I think they're trying to get some kind of conference going, similar to the CSW Women's Conference. Is that correct?
I think they're more focused on getting a convention going.
A convention.
Literally a convention. In other words, on the rights of older persons.
Right.
Yeah, and then the thing is, with the conferences in general, there was kind of a moment where the big conferences, the conferences that took place, I think the last group of them, we have to go back to the 90s. There hasn't, and I think the last big one that I'm aware of was, like I said, in 2001, the World Conference Against Racism, and then I think there were one or two after that, but mostly now, I think it has a lot to do with budget cutbacks and this kind of thing. So mostly people are meeting regionally and then trying to come together at headquarters. So headquarters here in New York. And I think right now what I'm seeing is that a lot of people are a bit stymied because of the whole have meeting virtually as opposed to in person. It's a little harder to network this way.
There have been a lot of complaints, though, that the civic space has been shrinking in recent years, even before COVID. And I was wondering what you thought about that.
I think it's so true. I think it's so true. Yes, it's painful to see the difference between, let's just say, going back to, we'll go back to the 20 years, huge difference between, and then even 10 years here, the direction is in the wrong direction. So that's painful because you have to work harder and harder to even meet people, see people, enter a room. It used to be that it was much easier really to enter a meeting or a room and have your voice heard. And now you have to work really hard and apply pressure.
And I don't think as much information is being shared so that, sometimes you don't even know about meetings. I mean, there is the UN journal and there are various, ways to find out, but it isn't like it was even 5 years ago, I think.
Exactly.
But with COVID,
even 5 years ago, the meeting. I agree. I agree. Yeah. Even 5 years ago, we knew more about when the meetings were going to be, and they were open to us, and much easier to schedule and have a meeting. Yeah, that's all true.
There are some nation states that are actually hostile to civil society, and then there are others that perhaps
they don't,
aren't standing up for us enough. Yeah, but we know that some of the countries are kind of bullies in that respect. As far as making sure that civil society, nonprofits, faith communities, what have you, are experts, academics, are included in the deliberations. I know that you have things to talk about as far as what the NGOs themselves can do. But first, is there something that the UN itself or its mechanisms, its agencies, that it can do?
Well, one of the things that I'm aware of is that every time procedures are set up, it's very important that we keep track of them. And what I mean by that is that there's literally guidelines for when NGOs can speak, or guidelines for when NGOs can organize something. So we have to be very aware. They can kind of sneak up on us, and then we can suddenly find out that there's no space for us. So it's very important that we keep an eye on these kinds of opportunities, and then make sure that we're on top of it. And the other thing that I think we almost always try to do is find friendly countries. And you were naming that there's a range of countries that way. And I would say historically, I'm going to give a big plus to the Scandinavian countries being extremely friendly to NGOs. So I think that's where we have to go. And I'm going to say something that everybody already knows. With the previous administration in the US, they were much friendlier to NGOs. So this is not a deep, dark secret.
Right. They certainly play favorites.
Not so friendly.
Yeah. It's just hard. And when you're there, you can sometimes tackle somebody in the hallway. And people will speak also a lot more candidly. When you speak face to face, they'll say something completely different than they will when they know that they're on camera. So that's another thing about diplomats.
It's so true.
Yeah. Your committee, though. Yes. We have these technical things going on, so sorry. But your committee has been very helpful because you have a very strong relationship with the Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights. So that's very much appreciated by the rest of the NGOs. And when we have those relationships and we share those relationships, then that helps everyone, obviously. So what can NGOs do that can improve their miserable lot right now?
Okay. Well, I think this isn't just true for the UN, but I think in general, especially now, it's kind of desperate times, right? So I think the more we can reach out to each other and again, I'm going to use the phrase common cause. So we can find common cause and be supportive of each other. And to the extent that people are, let's say, demonstrating, if you can safely demonstrate, I think you should literally demonstrate. And I think there are demonstrations going on right now, and I think some of them apply to climate change because it's an existential nightmare that we're all living. So I think, to definitely, wherever you can, don't try to do it by yourself or even with your own organization. I would say nothing against individual action, but now we need to come together wherever we can, without betraying whatever your cause is. But if you can find a common link, then I think it's a good thing to do. And when it comes to the Office of the High Commissioner for Rights, I think it's very, very valuable to understand how the different human rights mechanisms work. And I know, and you know quite a bit about this, but the more we can educate other people, other NGOs, general civil society, I think we should let them know that and find ways of being supportive to people all over the world by being in the same, let's say we were just talking about older persons. Well, if you're talking about older persons throughout the world, it's a more powerful thing to do than if you're just talking about a specific part of the world. So I think we should, wherever we can, come together that way. Yeah.
So now the cameras are all on the world leaders, on Trump, on Mexico, on Kazakhstan, or whoever is speaking. But then comes the meetings, the backroom meetings, the third committee, the fifth committee, these various committees that the public doesn't really know about. Yeah. So what would you suggest about working with the committees to get resolutions passed?
Okay, so I'll say what I know how to do when we're not living the way we are now. So I guess it's possible to do it this way, but I think it's going to be more difficult. The traditional way of working is that, let's say you and I are with some other people, and we all that we want thing about religious freedom promoted. And we want a resolution that specifically addresses the needs of some communities we're currently working with. Then the next step would be that we as a group would approach different missions that agree with that idea. And we'd ask, when we go to, let's say we go to the Norwegian mission, and they think that it's a good thing to do, they're happy to do this. They'll suggest to us, okay, well, we also think you should go to Sweden, something like that, right? Or somebody else will say, go to Costa Rica. So then what we're trying to do is gather as many sponsors as we can for a resolution that we all think is going to be valuable and important. And then we follow it. So that's the kind of the lobbying in the sense of the way we lobby at the UN. That's what it is. We go around and we lobby that way.
Yeah, and now it's going to be really hard to do that. With the third committee, usually there's a resolution on Burma, on the Rohingya, and most years it's the OIC countries or the OIC countries, the Muslim countries, plus Europe, the EU, and that's changed a little bit over the years, but it's pretty much the same now as before. And yet there's always this theater of a number of non-aligned nations raising their fists and opposing anything that might endanger sovereignty. They're very, very unified in that, whether it's Cuba or Venezuela or what have you. I think, and so one could think that they're trying to protect their own sorry human rights records by sticking together in this way. They don't seem to manage to. What? Yes.
Yeah. No, I could totally think that. No, I do think that. I mean, it's sort of like, okay, if we can protect these other people call that, then they'll protect us. So it's sort of that mutual, okay, we won't say anything about what you've done as long as you don't say anything about what we've done. And sometimes it's literally straight up bribery, meaning, okay, I'm going to be a little bit crass, but it's, do you want us to continue to give you aid? Do you want us to continue to support, different projects? It could be arms, it could be road building, whatever it is. Then you better not say anything about what we've been doing. And it's like that. I mean, that, sometimes I feel like having a subtitle under what they're doing is like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
you won't call it out, so we won't call you out. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's
and it does.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go on. No, I was just going to say it's the kind of where if it is, and then you're always trying to find out, well, kind of around the margins, like where can you be strategically find something that they won't be so angry about or so upset about, and there be some language you can introduce. So you were just talking about what the U.S. said today, and there might in the way they talked about supporting religious freedom. So maybe you go ahead and think, okay, well, maybe we can, even though we know the hypocrisy, we can still try to work around it and use it to our advantage.
Right. We adopt their vocabulary and their framework. With the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is the sanctions on Iran, basically, the U.S. has declared that it won't play along and that it's putting the sanctions in place all by itself. And the whole UN, including the Secretary General, is saying no, which is pretty interesting. I don't know what to make of it as far as impact.
Well, I'm going to say that to use a New York expression, the chutzpah, the chutzpah of the U.S. to think that they can withdraw from these different agreements and then suddenly say, okay, well, now we want you to all back us, right after we said, we're not in any way supporting anything you've worked on all these years. So I don't think that the other countries, and certainly the Secretary General, had any choice but to say, no. Because then we have no framework. We have no, every agreement has to do with trust, right? In life, right? So in other words, if you and I have agreement and we don't uphold end, then you can trust me going forward, right? And I won't trust you. So this is a case of breaking a trust,
right?
And then coming back and saying, okay, well, now I changed my mind. Now I want you to agree with me. Well, then how could people say, no, I'm not going to agree with you. You just broke off everything that we worked so hard to build.
Yeah, so who's going to trust the U.S.? Yeah, it's hard to know who would trust the U.S. It's a bit of like a Cold War, I think, at the moment, mainly with China. Maybe we could just share the link in the comments section of an article about COVID-19. There are some concerns about China's influence at the WHO, perhaps, but for Trump to state that they're totally controlled, he throws everything out the window. He closes the door to negotiation and all of that. He gives up his leverage. So I think that's the problem with U.S. policy now.
Okay, so I'm going to just add one thing that I know you know well about, which is that we withdrew from the Human Rights Council. Okay, so you withdraw from the Human Rights Council, then you say, okay, we don't like anything that's happening in the Human Rights Council. Well, we're not there. We withdrew.
Mm-hmm.
So this whole notion that you can withdraw and then still think that you still have the same rights you had when you were actively engaged, it just doesn't work that way.
Right.
Yeah. So that's
it's not our problem. It's not our fault. Yeah. Okay. We're going to just break for a station break for a few seconds, and we'll be right back. This is UN This Week.
Billboards are popping up all over the country with an
Our neighbors don't
eye-catching
realize
message.
that Muslims are absolutely opposed to ISIS.
Salam. My name is Abdul Malik Mujahid. I'm an imam in Chicago.
16 shots! No peace! No justice! No peace!
So how do we bring up the energy which can really have an impact on the world? You need to build bridges of understanding among people, and we need to have America moving forward. That lesson learned have brought the strength of humanity to America, which is the diversity.
Mujahid Talks, only on Muslim Network TV. Faithfully connected.
Hi, this is Adam Carroll with UN This Week with our guest, Bobby Nasser, Dr. Bobby Nasser of the UN NGO Committee on Human Rights. And we've been speaking about shrinking civic space and defending human rights at the UN. UN is both in New York and in Geneva. I think Geneva has been a little bit more accessible in recent years. I don't know if that will continue now with us all on Zoom, but at least I hear that NGOs feel more included in Geneva. Do you agree?
Everything I've ever heard is that that's the case. And there's a kind of irony to it because, so I'll just say the irony. The irony is that the bottom line decisions are generally made here in New York at headquarters. So this is where the Security Council is, and this is also where the GA is. And frequently they call it not traveling right across the pond, meaning that there'll be maybe a very strong statement made about, let's say, the human rights of the Rohingya in Geneva, but by the time it gets here, it gets watered down and it doesn't really survive the Security Council or even the GA. And a lot of different missions will say that they have a very different freedom to pursue human rights issues in Geneva that they don't have here.
Oh,
and that's what I was saying before about the Human Rights Council. That it's it's you know, it's sort of like, well, okay, these really great reports. Like just this past week, I was hearing a really good event that was put together virtually on the situation in Venezuela. And as I'm aware, but I think many people are aware that it's kind of a nightmare. Or I shouldn't say kind of, it is, I think, a full-blown nightmare in Venezuela to live there. Besides, the starvation and the lack of medical care and all kinds of people being, I'll just say, tortured, disappeared, all this kind of stuff. They're also, in every way, not receiving any relief. So there's a kind of blocking of any kind of humanitarian assistance into Venezuela. Anyway, there was a fact-finding mission that was generated out of Geneva, out of the Human Rights Council, that put together, I think, a very strong report showing how bad things are, how difficult things are inside Venezuela. And this is a good example of coming together with the resources of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, who put together this report. And they were, the way it works is that these reports have to be agreed to in the Human Rights Council. In other words, there have to be enough countries that say, yes, we think this is a good idea. Please go ahead and have a fact-finding mission. So they did this. And then they joined with civil society, and then they're talking about, well, what's the appropriate follow-up? What do we need to do to make sure that the problems that were identified in the fact-finding are now addressed? And this, again, a good example, I think, of bringing together the two sides, the civil society side and the UN, the resources of the UN. And it definitely comes from civil society. The advocacy is what caused the fact-finding mission to take place. So it's a very good example, and that's where I think NGOs can be very supportive of each other when this kind of thing happens. Yeah. So
I think bringing in human rights not in its own silo, as people like to say, but into relationship with development, right, or with humanitarian relief, that we need to bring in human rights principles into basically everything. And the sustainable development goals are supposed to help with that. But there's political will. And, we've got Syria, Yemen, Libya. We've got so many problems that it would take the whole show just to list it. And then we've got COVID-19. I really appreciate that you've been, you took some supportive action on the Uyghur issue. And I think that, that's a very important concern that hasn't been addressed nearly enough at the United Nations. It's got to be, and we know that it will be blocked in the Security Council. So we were just discussing before the show how basically what we all have to come up with in most issues is workarounds. So, just figuring out ways to create court cases or investigations. You were just talking about fact-finding missions, just getting some momentum going. And so I really hope that we'll be able to see that happen at the UN, despite whatever bullying takes place from China, which really has no tolerance for scrutiny whatsoever. So as far as the gender parity, one bit of good news that I did want to bring up is that the Secretary General has made that a priority in his hiring and his appointments, and that the UN does have gender parity in its higher level positions, and he's working towards creating that balance between male and female employees on every level, which is given the state of the world, that's fairly impressive. I was wondering if you had anything you wanted to add, because yeah.
Well, I think in general, the more the Secretariat specifically found a way to support, I guess the expression is walking the walk, not just talking the talk. So I think I don't envy this particular Secretary General. The timing of his tenure, I think is beyond challenging. But I have great respect for him doing that, and I think he comes from this background of working with refugees and migrants in general, and I think he has an appreciation for what it means to be in one of these situations where you don't have the full rights of being a citizen, and you become even extra marginalized. So I have great respect for what he's doing that way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, besides working more with the Norwegians, do you have any last bit of advice for other NGOs or people who want to get involved with the UN?
Well, my big piece of advice is that it's much more accessible, I think. And if you're not a registered NGO, meaning you haven't gone through the whole process of becoming, as you and I both have this kind of accreditation, you can still join forces with NGOs. So it's valuable. Whatever your issue is, there's a group of us waiting to work with you. So I think pretty welcoming.
So
come on.
That said, we could all use the help and the support. So I thought I would just put on the screen something from one of our allies. It's from, let's see, Better World Campaign. And this is just showing that most Americans do support the UN and agree U.S. should maintain an active role, and 71%, smaller but still okay, support the U.S. paying dues to the UN. U.S. government does not pay all its dues, and we've withdrawn not only from Human Rights Council, as we were talking about, but from UNESCO and from a few other agencies, WHO, of course. So this it goes against what most Americans want. And then the next link is also just to go down. That is if we scroll down, it's a petition asking Congress to, if you keep scrolling, I think if you can keep scrolling down, this is a petition on that website. We're going to put the link into the comments section and also perhaps onto the screen. But this is from the Better World campaign. And it's just asking Congress not to abandon the UN, basically. We're part of this world. It's multilateral. It's about building partnerships. It's facing global threats, existential threats like climate change, and as well as poverty that is always with us. So, I guess that's really it.
Let me just say,
please.
I say one small little advocacy, which is that the amount of money is very, in terms of our budget, it's a fraction of a fraction. So the idea that we're spending all this money at the UN, it's a very low budget operation to begin with, and our share is really very, very small. So I just wanted to say that. Yeah.
Thank you. So everybody, please support the UN,
Okay.
and don't forget the NGO community. We're here and we're not going away. So thank you all. Thank you, Bobby. And we'll see you next show.